Hello and welcome to the Make It Conscious podcast. This is episode 4. My name is Max Chegwin, and today I'm going to be talking about empathy. What is empathy? Why is it important? What is empathy from a psychospiritual perspective? And I'm going to be explaining why empathy is absolutely critical when it comes to spiritual growth. Why one cannot actually grow spiritually without empathy. Why empathy is actually intrinsic to the process of spiritual growth. And I'm going to be talking about signs of empathy, how to spot it, not merely just in terms of what it looks like, but really understanding what empathy is and therefore how we can be discerning in our daily interactions, as well as embody empathy in ourselves as a way to move forward spiritually. What inspired me to make this episode is that I think there's a lot of confusion around empathy and what it is, right? We'll get onto some of the classical definitions of empathy in a moment. But it occurred to me just how important, crucial empathy is to the path of spiritual growth. And in a similar way to what I've been talking about in these previous 3 episodes, as to how spiritual growth and spirituality are essential to our well-being individually and to our evolution from here on in, not just as individuals, but actually culturally, and how it's actually essential if we wish to preserve our civilization. No exaggeration, right? We need spirituality. And yet there's such little agreement over what spirituality actually is, right? And people have asked me, Max, what actually is spirituality, right? So that sort of inspired the first 3 episodes right there. And in a similar way with empathy, it is absolutely vital, and yet there's not a lot of understanding, let alone agreement over what empathy actually is. And a lot of this is because we're viewing it from a very materialistic scientific perspective, which in my opinion doesn't quite get to the heart of what empathy really is. So the title of this episode is Empathy and Spiritual Growth. So I'm going to kick things off with an obligatory quote from Carl Jung. He said that the meeting of 2 personalities is like the contact of 2 chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. And he goes on to say in this particular essay that both people being transformed when they meet is inevitable. There's always going to be something made conscious on both sides. And if it's not done consciously, in other words, if we show up thinking that we just want to transform this other person, right, we're going to help them, right? Exert our spiritual, ethical superiority onto them and give them a lesson, then we're not going to be conscious of how we have been transformed in the process. And we will inevitably be transformed just unconsciously. And that whole mentality negates the idea that this person showed up for us for a reason. We brought them into our world for a reason. We perceive them the way we perceive them for a reason. And so there is always something that we can take out of it as well. Whether just as individuals or indeed as coaches, therapists, in our daily livelihoods, whatever they are, every interaction we encounter involves a transformation on both sides. Now to a quote from Michael Tsarion. He says, "What about empathy? Is empathy's origin truly in the external world, where one might imagine it to be learned? Is it all just part of a Darwinian evolution to help us with our survival? Well, that's clearly just explaining it away." And I agree. I think we cannot explain the existence of empathy merely by something useful that appeared through a process of Darwinian evolution. It's not merely a personality trait that one develops. It is a quality of mind. But it wouldn't be a podcast on empathy if we didn't at least look at what the classical definitions of empathy are. So let's go there. Oxford Dictionary defines empathy as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So yes, that is kind of what empathy is. That is certainly what empathy looks like. It is that ability, sure, But again, that's not really getting to the heart of what empathy really is. It's merely explaining it as an ability. I think empathy is more than an ability. We'll get to that. Wikipedia describes empathy as the capacity to understand or feel what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. That is, the capacity to place oneself in another's position. True, sure, the capacity to understand or feel. Again, this helps us to understand what empathy looks like, perhaps, but it doesn't really explain why we have this capacity. What is this capacity? Is it merely a skill that we develop? Is it like, just an ability, like going back to the Oxford definition? Is it something that some people have and some people don't have? Like, what actually is it? Classically, we subdivide empathy down further into two sort of subtypes. There is affective empathy, known as emotional empathy, which is the ability to respond, as it says here, and respond with an appropriate emotion to another's mental states. So that's disputable, I think. It's like if you experience what another's experiencing, that's one thing. But if you don't respond appropriately, so if you see someone who's sad and you start crying, and maybe you're at a situation where it's not considered appropriate, right? It's not socially appropriate to cry right now. Would that be empathy? Apparently not, according to Wikipedia. Likewise, cognitive empathy is the ability to understand another's perspective or mental state. That sounds quite differently from the affective empathy, right? One is responding appropriately to another's mental state. The other is understanding another's mental state. Now, these are two entirely different cognitive processes, experiences. But according to our classical definitions of empathy, they're both empathy. So as it says here, the scientific community has not coalesced around a precise definition of these constructs, but there is consensus about this distinction. Generally speaking, if a scientific concept is just hammering at trying to make all the parts fit, and it just can't make them work and has to sort of patch them up and just cobble them together in a way that sort of makes observational sense, but doesn't really sort of make up a consistent theory, well, generally that suggests that they've been barking up the tree the whole time. There's something here that's not being worked with, like they're building it on some kind of foundation that doesn't actually make sense in itself. So they're building on this foundation of everything's material, and therefore we can just make this idea of empathy like appear somehow in that theory. We know what it looks like. We know that there's this emotional empathy. We know that there's this cognitive empathy, but we're just going to call them both empathy, and sort of it makes sense to us. Theresa Wiseman, a nursing scholar, noted 4 attributes of empathy: perspective taking, staying out of judgment, recognizing emotions, and being able to communicate that skillfully. So again, this is quite observational in terms of, okay, this is what empathy looks like. It means taking that perspective, whether it's emotional or intellectual, staying out of judgment. So, not condemning the other person, saying they're bad or wrong for having those feelings, or pushing them away because we don't like or identify with what they're displaying. Recognizing, being able to understand and label the emotions, and communicate that skillfully. But again, these are 4 very different, separate processes and cognitive functions here. They are talking really about the behavior that we call empathy. But I'm going to make the case that empathy is not merely a behavior. It is a quality of mind. Brené Brown, researcher who has done a lot of work on empathy, describes it as empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. So she's getting closer to the mark here. She's pointing out that unless I know that feeling, I can't experience that feeling. So indeed, we're experiencing ourselves. It's all we can ever experience. But what we experience the other person to be experiencing ignites something in ourselves. Again, though, this maybe doesn't look at what it means to know a feeling precisely enough. It doesn't clean slice the multiple ways in which we might know a feeling. We might know a feeling because it's unresolved in us, and therefore we project it onto other people, and therefore we experience those people in the world, It's our own mind trying to bring something out of us to try and make it conscious. Or maybe we know the feeling because we have experienced it in the past and resolved it. So you can know the feeling having resolved it, and you can know the feeling having not resolved it. And both of these things can be a form of empathy, according to these definitions. So we've touched on here what empathy can look like. We understand a bit about what it actually is, what it involves. We know it involves being compassionate towards others, right? That's part of empathy. So having this concern, this willingness to help others. We understand that it involves feeling what another is feeling, or what we suppose they might be feeling. Classically, we might understand it as being affective, emotional, or we might understand it as being cognitive, intellectual. What is the common denominator to all of these things? That's what I'm trying to get to here. What is the principle underneath all of this? And if we can understand that principle, can we therefore extrapolate from that principle and understand more about how empathy actually plays out in the world, how we can actually see empathy in others, how we can enable, make space for empathy in ourselves? So here's my psychospiritual perspective on empathy and what it is at its core. So how I think of empathy is it's a willingness to meet and be consciously transformed by experience. So this comes back to the Jung quote that if there's to be any reaction between two people, both are transformed. If there's a willingness to be transformed on both sides, that will be done consciously, and that will look like empathy. That will be empathy. But if there's no willingness to transform, then there's no empathy. So empathy is more than merely being kind and considerate and wanting to help people, right? It's actually a willingness to be consciously transformed by our experience. Let's flesh this out a bit, right? So empathy, good or bad, right? Is it a sign of spiritual progress or a spiritual strandedness? Now, I imagine you might well say, obviously empathy is good, right? And obviously it's a sign of spiritual progress. But if you ask a typical Theravada Buddhist, they might suggest that, well, if you're experiencing sadness around someone else's sadness, you're obviously not enlightened, right? So clearly there is a disagreement amongst spiritual practitioners as to whether we should be showing emotion or not showing emotion. Is expressing emotion a sign of progress, or is it a sign of being stuck? Is it good or is it bad? Okay, well, I would not say it was either good or bad. I would say it is conducive to wholeness. When we consider it in these terms, that empathy is a willingness to meet and be consciously transformed by experience, then I would suggest that empathy is indeed not only conducive to wholeness, it is sort of like the ultimate ingredient in a person's capacity to grow spiritually. It aligns to what I describe as habit 1 and habit 2 of the 7 habits of individuation. That is to take responsibility for your mind and to cultivate wholesome intentions, right? This is where empathy lies. It is a willingness to be consciously transformed by your experience. So actually, it really has nothing to do with whether we are showing emotion or not, really. So if we are experiencing a strong emotion in the presence of someone else's suffering, then that is pointing to something about our own mind. And if we were to just push that feeling away, try and look like we've got it all together, we're not experiencing that emotion, that would not be empathy, right? However, if we are willing to experience what is in our own mind, then that is certainly empathy. And through that process, both people can become transformed, right? They can actually work with each other to experience themselves through the other. And in that case, both people are practicing empathy, and both people can actually evolve spiritually as a result of that choice. So as I've said, empathy and spiritual growth are intrinsically linked. It's actually impossible to grow spiritually without empathy when defined in this way. And truly, we experience ourselves. We cannot experience anyone else. We can only experience our own minds. One way in which emotion is sometimes defined is as energy in motion. Now, it's a nice way of thinking about it, because it is essentially something being made conscious, right? if we feel a strong emotion, it is on some level a rebalancing of energy in our own psyche, something that was stored away, hidden as potential in the unconscious mind, becoming conscious. That's why emotions are cathartic. That's why we experience them to let things go, right? And we can't let them go unless we have truly experienced it and let that run its course. It's like an energetic necessity, right? That we take this potential energy and make it conscious and then let it dissipate. So with this in mind, I'm certainly always open to new information, but what I'm working with here is that I don't think we directly, literally experience what others experience, but their presence ignites something in ourselves. And so you could say even the very fact that they showed up was probably indicative of something, because if there is that potential energy in ourselves, like needing to be resolved somehow, the world will find a way to move and shift into a state where we can then face that unresolved emotion. So classically, we might think of empathy simply as feeling what others feel, but honestly, it's so much more than that. It is the willingness to consciously transform and be transformed by the world around you. And a lack of empathy, therefore, because it can really help to, if we really want to understand a concept, okay, what is the opposite of that thing? What happens if we don't have that thing? What does that look like? And a lack of empathy, therefore, is synonymous with an unwillingness to truly change, and in its place, a rigid, immovable persona. Persona being the way we've become conditioned to identify, like the mask we wear to the world, the way we want to be seen. And that's locked in by emotion because it was formed in early childhood when we weren't particularly conscious, right? Or we weren't as conscious as we are as adults. And so the affect we experienced and the situations we found ourselves in, the way we modeled ourselves on our parents or pushed aspects of them away, formed this unconscious pattern, which we compensate for with a persona. And, spiritual growth, certainly individuation, involves loosening our grip on the persona. It's not that a persona can't be useful from time to time. It's just that if we cling to it and we need to be that persona, then it is inevitable that the world will try and find a way for us to let go of it. But if we don't have empathy, then we're going to be in its place upholding this rigid persona. So this starts to sort of make a few things fall into place, I find. It's like, why is it that those who are very wise and spiritually evolved also tend to be quite empathic? Why is it that those who are not especially empathic or don't show the signs of empathy, even the superficial signs such as compassion and this sort of thing, if they're not showing a genuine interest to support other people, have you noticed that those kinds of people tend to also have quite a rigid persona, right? Tend to be very concerned about how they want to appear. Have you noticed how in certain circles and certain scenes where having a very rigid persona is very important, certain corporate environments or nightlife where, being seen a certain way is really, really important? Have you noticed the lack of empathy in these kinds of situations? So when we start to see empathy from this psycho-spiritual perspective, a lot of these other disparate pieces start to sort of fall into place, I find. So there is a difference, therefore, between understanding another's experience, experiencing another's experience, and having wisdom of another's experience. And it can be really helpful to delineate between these. Like understanding another's experience is merely intellectual. And in this sense, you could say that even narcissists and cult leaders have this cognitive empathy, right? This intellectual understanding of another's experience. But would it really be correct to call that empathy? Personally, I don't find it a particularly useful concept when applied in that way. What about experiencing another's experience, this emotional, affective empathy. So if our friend is sad and we feel sad with them, we feel that we are experiencing their sadness, sharing that sadness. But are we really experiencing their sadness? Or are we experiencing our own sadness with them as the mirror of our own sadness? So this alone, this affective empathy, this emotional empathy, we might call that empathy, right? If it's a willingness to experience it and to be transformed by it and to help transform our friend in the process and engage in that dynamic. But if we're just allowing unconscious emotions to arise and pushing them away and reveling in and identifying with our sadness, could that really be called empathy? I would say, no, I don't think that is empathy. But then there is wisdom of another's experience. It goes back to the Brené Brown quote. There's knowing another's experience, right? But there's knowing another's experience because you have been through it and you have resolved it. That's very different from knowing another's experience because it reflects something unresolved in yourself. And so a path of spiritual growth does not move someone towards a place where they become more and more and more sad and burdened by the sadness of the world and the painful experiences and feelings of the world. They will have experienced them, but they will have gone through them. And that is what makes the sage truly helpful to other people. And the sage will continue to be transformed by others' experience. Because if there was no reaction, there'd be no transformation, right? The difference is that the sage will not be transformed necessarily in the same way as the person they're helping. There'll be a reaction both ways. So whilst one person might resolve their sadness, the coach or the therapist in this situation is resolving another aspect of themselves. It might be getting comfortable with actually serving people in that way, letting go of their own fears of being the center of attention for a few minutes, for example, or being seen as someone capable of helping in that way. It may be letting go of any potential for conceit that might arise, or feeling that they are somehow better than the person they're helping, because they're truly not, right? But they may have gone through an experience that may be like what the other person is experiencing. So it's not therefore about firefighting or placating an emotional distress by sharing it with them, just merely pushing it back down into the unconscious, but actually working with the other person to resolve it, to make it conscious. So when we resolve our own unresolved conflicts, we will still be motivated to help, but we will not feel per se what the other person feels, or be perturbed or conflicted in ourselves. So this is not about dissociation. This is not about just saying, I want nothing to do with this, and just shutting down emotionally. That's not this at all. But it will not feel what the other person feels. We will not have that projection going on where we're actually feeling something unresolved in ourselves. So we'll still be on solid ground. And then we're actually in a genuine position to help. But in the interest of taking responsibility for our own mind, we have to be questioning if pain in others is showing up for us in a particular way, why is that happening? Is the very reason it is showing up is because it reflects something in ourselves? So in coming to really understand the principles of empathy from a psychological perspective, this is very helpful because true empathy cannot be faked. If you know what you're looking for, you will not be deceived by anybody trying to look empathic. So unlike compassion, sympathy, and wisdom, for example, right, these are all worthwhile qualities, but they can actually be faked more easily than empathy. Now, if you don't know what true empathy really is at a psychological level, then you're more likely to be deceived by fake compassion, fake sympathy, and fake wisdom, and think that what you're experiencing is empathy. But anything other than a genuine willingness to be transformed is merely a substitute that just looks like empathy. It's not the real thing. And once you understand empathy in this way, as a genuine willingness to be transformed by the world, you'll see that true empathy and fake empathy look very, very different, and you will never be deceived by fake empathy. Now to a quote by Brené Brown again. She says that shame is universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection. Now here's the thing. There's no one that doesn't experience shame, to be clear, but there are those who repress a feeling of shame. And so here she's pointing out the truth that if someone is not willing to experience shame, they don't have empathy. She goes on to elaborate that shame can be best thought of as a fear of disconnection. So for someone who experiences a lot of unresolved fear of disconnection, they're going to then pursue things in life that look like the remedy for that. Whatever looks like love, whatever looks like attention, right? This is when we get narcissism and everything on the spectrum up to full-blown personality disorders. There's always an unresolved feeling at the heart of it. This is precisely why empathy and persona are dichotomous. They are opposite ends of the same spectrum. So understanding what empathy actually is, rather than merely what it looks like, is essential for both spiritual growth and for discernment in our daily interactions. Because a lack of empathy often looks like empathy. It's easy to fake something that looks like empathy if you don't know what empathy truly is underneath. This is why lack of empathy is absolutely rife in our culture right now. It's a pandemic, right? It's unwillingness to transform and unwillingness to take responsibility for our own minds. Not least because we assume we've been raised on a paradigm of materialism. Right? If we just fix the world to be a certain way, then we can fix our minds, right? Regrettably, no. And actually, maybe not regrettably, I'd probably rather it was this way round, where it starts and ends with the mind. And true empathy doesn't always look like empathy. Both can show up in any number of ways. So being truly empathic, being truly willing to transform with the world and be of service to others to help them transform, does not necessarily show up in the form of sharing people's problems, dwelling in their misery, validating their own feeling sorry for themselves. Right? Sometimes that is closer to what is needed, but sometimes it absolutely isn't. Right? Any good therapist will tell you this. Sometimes what people really need is not someone to throw fuel on the fire of their self-deception. So here's a sort of a meme, I suppose, that I stumbled upon online once. And, this is the kind of thing that our pop spirituality leaders are sharing in this day and age. And it goes, "I'm honestly not mad at anyone for anything they ever did to me. You showed me the real you. I needed that." So aside from being flagrantly passive-aggressive, it's also fallacious psychologically, because no one ever shows us the real them. We don't see the real them. We see us and can only see us. Doesn't mean we can't observe unwholesome behavior in others. Doesn't mean we can not understand that, because on some level we have experienced it in ourselves and made it conscious. So, this is regrettably what is passing for wisdom these days. I've seen this shared by very popular, very influential people. And this is what motivates me to analyze this whole subject a little bit closer, try to understand what empathy really is. It's not that. This is more like it. Okay, so this is a poem by Khalil Gibran, or at least it's part of a poem. It's from his book, The Prophet, and this is The Prophet on Marriage. He says, "Love one another, but not make a bond of love. Let it rather be a moving sea between the shores of your souls. Fill each other's cup, but drink not from one cup. Give one another of your bread, but eat not from the same loaf. Sing and dance together, and be joyous, but let each one of you be alone, even as the strings of a lute are alone, though they quiver with the same music. Give your hearts, but not into each other's keeping, for only the hand of life can contain your hearts. And stand together, yet not too near together. For the pillars of the temple stand apart, and the oak tree and the cypress grow not in each other's shadow." Now imagine if that was the kind of content going viral this day and age, right? Imagine if this was a reflection of how people were thinking in this day and age. How transformed our culture would be. How much wiser we'd all be. How much more empathic we'd all be. And notice, sing and dance together and be joyous, but let each one of you be alone. Even as the strings of a lute are alone, though they quiver with the same music. And yet we often think, don't we, in this day and age, that to truly help someone, we have to get down with them and be there with them, be the same as them, experience what they're feeling directly. And for the reasons I've explained, that's not truly the way to growth, individuation. That is often a way of justifying one's own unwillingness to go near their own conflicts. So as I've explained, empathy sits in opposition really to rigidity. If empathy is a willingness to be transformed, rigidity is an unwillingness to be transformed. And so these things exist on a spectrum. And hence why, when we look at, say, people with narcissistic personality disorder, cult leaders and so on, why there is not only a lack of empathy, but there is also a grandiose persona. What is a grandiose persona other than an unwillingness to be transformed, right? It is saying, this is me, this is who I am, this is my role. And not only that, it's a grandiose role. It's the most important role in the world. It's a defense mechanism, right? So whereas materialist science might say, oh, well, what are the characteristics of narcissism? Well, there's the lack of empathy, there's that, yep, check. There's the grandiose persona, yep, you've seen that. There's the willingness to lie, and all. Yes, because it's really an unwillingness to be transformed by the world. That is what it is at its core. And the reason that is there is because the mass of unresolved emotion there is so great a magnitude that the individual would rather die than face that, right? So until they die, they're not going to face that unresolved feeling. It would just be too painful. It's just been buried so deep into the unconscious that going there is just untenable. So of course, there's going to be this adaptation, there's going to be this persona that needs to compensate. And there is often not just that underlying rigidity, but there's often a lot that looks like empathy, right? So it's very easy to be deceived by that and say, oh, look, they're so compassionate, or they're being so sympathetic and they appear so wise, if we don't understand what empathy truly is at its deep level. And so fundamentally, empathy cannot really be faked once you know what you're looking for. So the more rigid the persona, the lower the empathy generally. And of course, anyone can make a decision to let some of that go, and there's degrees of this. But the way I think of when something becomes pathological, when it becomes, say, for example, full-fledged narcissism, the reason for that is because the underlying unresolved feelings are extreme enough that they would rather die than face up to them. And if you look into the childhood of these people, often it could well have been a matter of life or death, certainly from the perception of the affected individual. So it's actually quite understandable why this kind of rigidity would come into force. But then, of course, in order to remain undetected, there then has to be this appearance of compassion and wisdom. And yet, if you look at the actual signs, there may be the appearance of those things, but what there isn't ever, right, in the case of narcissism, is a willingness to transform. this explains so much. So true connection requires both people to transform. And where there's no empathy, there's no true connection. There might be the appearance of connection. There may be the perceived experience of connection, but inexorably it does break down eventually. And it leaves people affected by this kind of dynamic, this codependency, quite confused often. It's like, hang on, I thought we had a connection here. What's going on? And there can be that craving, right, to just connect with this person. They need some support, they need some help, right? It's not possible unless that person is willing to transform themselves. True connection is not possible. And of course, for someone who is unwilling to transform, they don't necessarily realize this. They don't realize that every unit of rigidity, of deception, of cunning is another unit lost in the ability to truly connect with people. And so the true connection they really crave is actually not possible because they're not willing to be transformed by other people. They're too fearful of what might happen if they let their guard down for even a millisecond. So again, that's why empathy and connection are synonymous, because empathy is a willingness to learn about oneself through the world and other people. And that's when true connection actually occurs. So it wouldn't really be fair to say that people who lack empathy don't change. Of course they change. Of course, everything and everyone is changing all the time. There's really two kinds of change, right? There's transforming, and then there's merely adapting. And unless there's empathy in place, any kind of personal growth, personal development, personal transformation can really only be measured in terms of how well it gets me what I want, how much money it makes, how skillful am I in getting other people to do what I want them to do. That's not transformation. That's deciding on an image of self and then honing one's skills in manipulating reality, including other people, to fulfill that self-image. So empathy allows us to grow and transform. And without it, we simply adopt strategies that allow us to adapt to our world. But strategies are only sustainable insofar as we are willing to tolerate their limits on our freedom. There's nothing free about having to maintain a rigid persona. It's actually incredibly limiting. So true freedom can only come if we work on our mind, and it can only come if we embody empathy. Carl Jung agrees. He said that freedom stretches only so far as the limits of our consciousness. So if we've buried a lot of unresolved feeling in the unconscious, that's going to be very constricting on our freedom. And it's only when we go through that, not around it, right? Not placating it, not defending against it, but go through it. Allow that thing to dissipate consciously. That's how we create freedom. It starts and ends with the mind. So now let's look at what true empathy really looks like. Bearing in mind that it's a quality, right? It's not a personality trait. Anyone can act compassionate, but when we understand what true empathy really is, it cannot be faked. So here's what it really looks like. A willingness to take responsibility. Again, referring this to habit 1 of the 7 habits of individuation. That includes responsibility for one's own mind. Okay, so that means that when they encounter situations that they find displeasing, painful, traumatic, and so on, they look at their own mind and say, why was this a problem for me? What does this tell me about my own mind? And what am I hanging on to here? To say nothing of the external situation, but their own personal experience, what does that tell them about their own mind? It's not enough to merely talk about it, or to talk about how, through all their taking responsibility in their earlier years, they've got to where they are now, and now they're enlightened, and now they don't have to do it anymore. No, absolutely not. There's no human on earth, and there never will be a human on earth, that is able to stop taking responsibility for their mind. Also, practicing wholesome intentions, including compassion. So again, compassion can be faked, but if you observe someone over a course of time, whether it's a spiritual leader or whoever, you start to see patterns. And compassion, the interest in or concern for the misfortune of other creatures, that's a form of empathy. Because really what that's doing is it's looking again at why this is showing up for oneself, what this is showing them about their own mind, and how they can resolve not only their own issues, but they can help resolve the issues in the other person as well, through compassion, through that intention. True empathy is uninterested in jostling, unkind speech, and making fun of others. This pertains to habit 3 of the 7 habits, which is skillful communication. If we find ourselves needing to put other people down, to make fun of them, to be harsh to them, it's because there's something in ourselves we're not accepting. It's a flagrant sign of a lack of empathy. And again, no surprise therefore that if there is that kind of behavior, there's also probably a rigid persona going on that is not willing to be let go of. Also, uninterested to brag or excessively talk about oneself. Where would be the benefit in that, right? That suggests an unwillingness to transform. If there's a need to brag, say, this is who I am, this is what I've done, this is my accomplishments, hint, hint, therefore this is what I'm like, this is how I'm valuable, right? Or talk about oneself when it's not actually necessary. This suggests a kind of attachment to an idea of self. And where there's an attachment to an idea of self, there's generally also an unwillingness to actually transform further. So likewise, no excessive need to be seen any certain way at all. Doesn't matter what other people see us as. Respecting the sovereignty of others. So if someone is aspiring to self-sovereignty, they're also going to be respecting the sovereignty of others. They're not going to try and impose their own views or advice on this other person unless it's solicited. And even then, they're going to understand that this is just from my perspective, this is what I've been through. And truly understanding that other people's experience is different and different for many totally valid reasons. This is not just something we echo because we want to sound holy, right? This is a genuine understanding. A track record of transforming, learning and moving forward. If you've observed this person over a number of years perhaps, or you've just met someone and you know they used to be involved in a certain industry or a certain job or business, have they actually transformed? Have they actually learned, truly learned? Not just adapted, right? Not just adopted strategies that have gone on to just act as a cage for this person. Have they truly freed themselves through transformation? They truly integrated the experience. So some red flags, some things that usually point to this unwillingness to transform would be things like erratic behavior in relationships with no clearly justifiable or discernible reason. Going hot and cold, right? So being very friendly one moment and then the next day or the next time you see them being very cold, right? Trying to sort of remove you from your center. If you're ever left with a sense of what is going on with this person, like where are we at? I would say it's a red flag. Now, with the caveat that it would not be productive or wholesome to dwell excessively on what is going on or try to figure it out, right? Because inevitably we're going to be projecting our own concerns into that situation. So it's really helpful to have the insight here of, again, take responsibility for the mind. Why is this showing up for me? What does this mean for my mind? And understand how we might be projecting our own fears into the situation. But once we've isolated that and we can really see that in ourselves, to then go, okay, what is really going on here? Like, they seemed like they really wanted to sort of hang out and be friends. And then I sort of, sent them a Facebook friend invite, let's say, and then they just didn't respond to it for 3 days. Is there something going on there? Like, is this person actually practicing empathy? Are they actually willing to transform? Or are they playing games? The opposite of wholesome intentions, including compassion, is kind of approximate to game playing, right? And it comes with deception, manipulative inconsistency. And that stretches to simply not being upfront as well, right? So deception is more than just straight up lying. It can also be not being upfront. Because there's no reason for anyone to ever not be upfront unless there's a conflict that they're trying to avoid, to not go near, right? And with that, an unresolved feeling. So if someone's playing games and trying to use deception of various kinds to sort of gain an advantage on you and so get one up on you, then that's power play and that's not empathy. This is someone who has set their foothold in where they are, and whilst they might go through the motions of looking like they're evolving and talking about personal growth and this kind of thing, really, unless they're displaying empathy, this is not a person who's interested in genuine spiritual and personal growth. Another red flag here is excessive self-promotion, including excessive attention to one's own physical appearance. Now, I know it's often noted by particularly men online that the women they are most attracted to always seem to have some kind of irreconcilable psychological conflict. Well, hopefully this episode has given some insight into why that might be. Because if someone is paying excessive attention to their appearance and enhancing their appearance in various ways and doing so as a way to uphold this persona and self-image because they want to be seen a certain way and they want to remove other people from their center as a way to uphold that self-image, well, here you have it, right? By the same token, there's going to be a rigidity, there's going to be an unwillingness to change, an unwillingness to be transformed and to take responsibility and dynamically interact with the world, including you, as part of that. There you go. That's, in a nutshell, why people who take excessive concern over their appearance, like way beyond the point of merely being, attractive and respectful, but to the point of trying to descend to other people and gain power over them, that is why there's always going to be some kind of consequence to that in the dynamic of the relationship, and it comes down to a lack of empathy. Pouncing on vulnerabilities of others or using vulnerability against you. Major red flag, this one. And unfortunately, something that a lot of coaches still do, and I think that motivates a lot of coaches to get into coaching, because it's maybe not so much about being empathic and working on themselves and helping others at the same time. It's about placating an inner conflict and insecurity by waiting for the opportunity to pounce on others and then use that vulnerability as a way to get power over them, right? This is a favorite tactic of cult leaders, right? They'll get you to discuss your issues and share your concerns and your problems, and they'll do that under the guise of like wanting to help you. But really, when it comes down to it, they'll then use what you said against you later, use that vulnerability against you so that they can obtain power and control over you. A lack of accountability, another red flag. And by the way, this also applies to organizations. In fact, these all apply to organizations as well. I remember once I had a query with Facebook. I sent them a message and another one came back and it explained to me that they weren't able to help me on this occasion, and sorry that if this might be disappointing, and we truly understand this is frustrating, and so on and so forth. And it was signed by Mary, right? And so sometime later I sent another message sort of trying to plead with them and try and talk some sense because I didn't agree with their response. Immediately I got the exact same reply. We have taken this time to consider your message, and believe us, we have really considered this carefully, and so on and so forth. But this time it was signed John. So it was like, it clearly wasn't a real person by this point. And it was like they weren't even trying to make it seem like it was actually a real person. It was actually highly disrespectful. And so it's almost this kind of complacent, lack of accountability, we're untouchable. And this applies to organizations as a whole. And so it was no surprise to me that 2 years later, Facebook had some terrible problems and their share price dropped when they were found out of sharing people's data unethically. So, this lack of accountability very much will permeate a culture like that. And it will be done with the view of, oh, we're so big and powerful, we don't need to actually, we're so important, we have this rigidity, we don't need to transform and listen. And it was absolutely no surprise to me that actually they really did suffer consequences as a result of their lack of accountability. So, if you're wondering what kind of organization to work with, look for an organization that is willing to take accountability and take feedback and actually transform in response to that. So last but not least, unsolicited advice, right? Needing to tell you what they think, needing to say what they think is right. This is another red flag that suggests another a lack of empathy. So, if people are very, very willing to pipe up and tell you what they think you should do and tell you like where they think your flaws are and this kind of thing, if that's unsolicited or not in response to something you've done to them, then that would certainly be a red flag and indicative of a lack of empathy. So just some things to be aware of there in this changing understanding of what empathy really is and what to bear in mind as to how to discern interactions. And my hope is not that people who are unwilling to take responsibility for their mind would look at this and go, okay, here's how I now need to behave in order to not take responsibility for my mind and in order to look empathic. Instead, I hope that in really coming to understand this concept of empathy more precisely, that it will actually be impossible for anyone to convince you that they are being empathic when they are not. And understand that actually empathy is vital for spiritual growth. It's not some bolt-on that we need to practice because we're a therapist. It is the very way we interact with the world. It's an attitude and a willingness. And that we can now understand that and embody that in ourselves. Rather than push interactions away, push people away, defend, and try and understand what other people are doing that's wrong and harmful to us, we have to work with all those situations and use them as fuel to truly transform, to make our unconscious conscious. And that is the way to achieve genuine spiritual growth and freedom as a result of that. So I'm just going to end by reading something that I wrote a few months ago. This was just a very simple and quick Instagram post, but here it goes. It's called "The True Sage is a Student of Evil." Whether or not evil exists, it certainly doesn't help much to pretend that it doesn't. The sage, far from being the picture of good, knows this all too well. But evil doesn't look like evil. Evil is interested in control, not freedom. And the most insidious form of control is that which looks and feels like freedom. No one knows evil more than the sage, the free individual. He or she gets close to it, studies it, unconsciously at first. It has something they don't appear to have, then consciously. Through their pain, they come to see it clearly and integrate the malevolence in themselves. Then the game is up. There is no match for unconscious evil like the sage acting consciously in their new knowledge. By making the unconscious conscious, they come to understand evil more than evil itself. I'm going to leave that there, guys. I hope that was useful, and I shall talk to you next time.